All right. Well, my name is Vinay Lal, and I'd like to welcome you to this class, which is a course on the history of South Asia post-1947. 1947 is the time when India acquired its independence. The first country, really the first major country in the world to decolonize, following a long period of colonialism, not just in India, but in most parts of Asia and certainly in Africa. So if you were to ask me what is the most important feature of the second half of the 20th century, I would say it's decolonization. The fact that the vast majority of countries around the world actually became free, acquired their independence. Curiously enough, if you read most histories written of the world in the second half of the 20th century, they barely mention it, particularly if they happen to be written from the standpoint of a historian working in the United States or in Britain. There are many historians of Britain who still write the history of Britain as if Britain didn't have any colonies, as if India was not a major colony of the British for 200, 250 years, for example. Okay, but that is the point of origin, 1947. Although in order for you to understand that point of origin, 1947, we'll certainly have to go back a few years, which I'm going to do in the second half of my lecture today, once I've gone through the syllabus and the requirements, and we'll continue with that in the following lecture. And then from there, we will start to look properly at the history of India post-1947. Secondly, this course is called The Cultural and Political History of Contemporary South Asia. But let me be quite frank with you. The bulk of the material is going to be on India. South Asia is a region of the world which is comprised of several countries. India is not the only country. The other countries are, of course, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, a couple of countries that most people have never heard about, Bhutan, and the Maldives. Right? So we won't be too worried about what's happening in Bhutan and Maldives. We're not even going to be too worried about what's happening in Pakistan. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is that the literature on India is much richer than the literature on Pakistan and Bangladesh. And today, in particular, it's difficult to talk about Pakistan without immediately hearing the word Taliban. Right? I mean, all you have to do is read the New York Times, and anytime there's a news item on Pakistan, all it has to do with is drone attacks. Right? Because, of course, that's the preferred American way of dealing with any problem. Just go and drop a few bombs. You know, you can't solve a problem? Well, let me drop a few bombs. They've done it often enough. They've been doing it for several decades. They've become masters at it. Right? So the only time you ever hear about Pakistan is when there are going to be drone attacks, or when you hear about the Taliban, or you hear about some brutal attack by some group or the other, you know, and the Americans somehow get involved. Right? That's really the literature that you get. Of course, there is a richer scholarly literature, but I can tell you it doesn't compare to the literature you have on India. The other reason why we're going to be focused on India, there will be occasional remarks about Pakistan and Bangladesh, to be sure. I mean, it's not possible to talk about events of 1971, which we're going to get to much later on, without obviously talking about Pakistan and the creation of a new nation state called Bangladesh. There was no Bangladesh before 1971. It used to be called East Pakistan, as you'll see. All right? So you've had divisions and divisions after 1947. So there will be occasion to talk about Pakistan and Bangladesh, occasional references to Nepal, Sri Lanka, but other than the fact that India provides the richest literature, there is no question that India is obviously the country that defines South Asia more so than any other country, such as Pakistan or Bangladesh. All right? So we're going to be really focused on India over here. Keep in mind, and I'm going to constantly reiterate that many of the conclusions, by no means all of them, because I do happen to think that India and Pakistan went quite different ways in many respects, although these societies are very similar. I mean, if you ever speak to people who've lived in India, who live in India, and who've traveled to Pakistan, or vice versa, people who live in Pakistan and travel to India, particularly if we're traveling to northern India, okay, many of the people will tell you the societies are remarkably similar even today. And of course, there's no reason why they shouldn't be, because they come out of the same soil, right? And Pakistan was only created by taking out a portion, as it were, of India in 1947, of undivided India, right? The word partition itself, which we're going to begin with, is actually a word with a very troubled history, because when we speak about the vivisection of India in 1947 and we use the word partition, well, in Pakistan they don't really call it the partition, you know. Right? So we're going to look at a little bit of that, and those will be the occasions when we'll talk about Pakistan and Bangladesh, but effectively this is really a course on India post 1947, and I'm interested in the political history not in the narrow sense of the term. When I say the narrow sense of the term, what I mean by that is it would be like doing a political history of the United States where all you were really studying was, you know, the supposed difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. Right? That you looked at these two political parties and you said, well, we're really going to study these political parties and what they do. You know, what do their senators, what do their representatives do, how do they work? And that's politics. Well, we know that politics is a great deal more. Politics includes grassroots movements. It includes agitations by workers and unions, the Occupy movement. That's politics. I'm more interested not in party politics, so we're not going to be hearing a lot about the Congress Party, which used to be the dominant party in India for a very long period of time. For those of you who follow events in India, you know that they got virtually wiped out in the last election. Okay, virtually wiped out. Which is extraordinary given that this party has a history going back to 1885. It's one of the oldest political parties in the world, right? So if we were doing a history only of politics, talking about political parties, then we'd have to do really an extensive historical survey of the Congress Party and see what is a trajectory that takes us from 1885 to 1947 and then from 1947 to the present, but we're not going to be doing that. You know, because, as I said, my interest is not in that kind of politics, but in a much more expansive conception of what we mean by politics. And then I'm also interested in the cultural history. And I'm going to go through the syllabus in substantial detail with you. And when I say cultural history, that includes such phenomena as modern cinema. Right? I mean, to most people living in this country, if you had to say, well, what is it that you know about India? And I'm going to be interested in reading what some of you have written, right? I mean, if people have any familiarity with India at all, it generally happens to be something like, well, they've heard of the Taj Mahal. And if they're lucky enough, they've actually seen it. Okay? Not digitally, but being there. Right? Or they know about Bollywood and perhaps an Indian actress or actor or two. If they had Indian friends in school, then they might know that, well, there's something called a samosa, you know, which you can enjoy every now and then. So forth and so on. And those would be the predominant conceptions. And then, of course, for those who are a bit more interested, if you're interested in the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, well, you probably have heard of Gandhi. People would usually have heard of Gandhi through the Civil Rights Movement because most people here would be familiar, obviously, in fact, everybody would be, in some nominal sense of the term, with the figure of Martin Luther King. Right? And we know that Martin Luther King was the greatest advocate of nonviolent resistance in the aftermath of Gandhi. Right? So forth and so on. So those would be the ways in which one would generally imbibe some sense of what it means to speak about India. But the cultural history of India, of course, post-1947 is a great deal more complicated, as you can imagine. And it includes not just cinema, but it includes a wider conception of what we might describe as a public sphere. Okay, what is the nature of the public sphere in India? How do people negotiate the public sphere? You know, what is street culture in India like? Right? And how would we interpret it? So forth and so on. So this class has that ambition that it essentially is going to be looking at certain fundamental questions related to the history of India in the aftermath of Indian independence in 1947. Okay. Now, before I go on to describe the class in greater detail, and I shall do so by looking really at the syllabus and raising some broader questions, let me just very briefly go through a few administrative mechanical matters having to do with the requirements for this class, how you access the readings, and related questions of that kind. For those of you who are enrolled in the class, if you're not, by the way, and you're interested in enrolling, you're just sampling the class today, you don't need a PT number or anything. There's still room in the class. All you have to do is just go and enroll in it. And for all of those of you who are enrolled in the class, I'm sure you know that you can automatically access all the readings except for those readings which have been ordered for you as books, right, at the UCLA bookstore. So the bulk of the readings are online readings. My suggestion to you, you do it whichever way pleases you the most, but my suggestion to you is that if you have decided you're going to take the class, is you just go to the website and you just download all of the readings at one shot or two shots. You know, they're all PDF documents, and then you have everything intact with you and whenever you want to access those readings. There are only one or two readings which have not been placed online so far, but they will be before you're supposed to do those particular readings. Okay? Now, there are a few books that have been ordered for you at the bookstore. You are under no obligation to obviously buy them from the bookstore itself. You can buy them from any other vendor if you should want to do that, but the reason for ordering them at the bookstore obviously is it just makes it a lot easier. You can just simply go and pick them up. The reading for this course is going to amount to about 200 pages a week, okay? Which in my estimation, I've taught here for over 20 years, so I think I've been doing this long enough to know what I think is reasonable and what isn't. Although I'm always surprised, because when I first came here from the University of Chicago in 1993, after finishing my doctorate, I would typically assign 500 pages of reading a week, because that's what we were accustomed to. But of course, we are living in a very different age now. Very different age. I mean, all of you have smartphones, and they're more or less a part of a person's body these days. And I think that, you know, we're living in an exceedingly visual culture. I think the ability to read has been considerably degraded in my own experience in the last 4 decades. I mean, I can say this with, I can't give you any scientific facts to demonstrate that, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence coming from my peers, coming from students, to know how much students read and how much they can read and with what ease they can read and with what interest they actually read. I have 2 teenage children, and it's a struggle to get them to read anything, frankly, because just getting them off that damn phone is pretty much what you're occupied with all day. All right? So now the gist of it is this, that as I said, when I came here and started giving 500 pages of reading a week, of course I got the most atrocious comments I could think of. In the comments, as students would say, 500 pages, this guy must think that this is the only class I'm taking. So then, of course, I reduced it to 450. Then I reduced it to 400, then to 350, then 300, then 250. And now for the last few years, it's about 200, and it's not going to go down any further. I decided that because, frankly, you really have to do some reading in order to be able to get along with the material and understand what are the perspectives that different people are offering. I mean, of course, one option is to do no reading at all, just listen to the lectures and just hope that you can get by with those, you know, right? And, you know, I mean, if you want to play Russian roulette, well, fine, you know, try it. Right? That would be one way to look at it. You have to do the reading. The reading is, for the most part, extremely pleasant. Okay? I mean, I've picked it quite deliberately. You're not reading Hegel here. Okay? I mean, you're not going to have to spend 1 hour on one page and trying to really figure out the meaning of what the author is saying. You're not reading Immanuel Kant or Hegel or Heidegger or one of these, you know, impossibly difficult philosophers, as some people would say, right? I mean, you're reading, you know, historians who, for the most part, don't believe in obscurity, okay? Don't believe in making things obscurantist, right? That generally the prose here is quite simple, but that doesn't mean that the arguments are not complex. There's no necessary relationship between the complexity of the prose and the complexity of the argument. There may be and there may not be. Right? And this is not 18th century writing. For those of you familiar, if you study 18th century English literature, you know that one sentence can be 30 lines long, and there can be 10 semicolons and 5 colons and several dashes. No, this is not that kind of reading. This is, as I said, reading that is extremely pleasant. There's a book, by Aman Sethi, A Free Man. You should be able to finish that book, in 5 or 6 hours. Okay, it's 225 pages, and as I said, it's not just simple reading, but it's very pleasant reading, and yet I think there are complex arguments either in the book itself or complex arguments that one can extract with some degree of thinking. Okay, so that's what you have to bear in mind as far as the reading goes. Those are very general remarks on the reading without going into the particulars of any single text. Now, the written requirements, the formal requirements of the course are that you have to do one short paper, 5 to 6 pages in length, double spaced. Okay, and if you look at page 3 of the syllabus, it specifies quite clearly, what the font should be. Try to follow those instructions if you can, right? They're not very difficult. And 5 to 6 pages, and by the end of the 3rd week, I will give you a list of prompts to help you decide what you're going to write your paper on. But you have extremely wide latitude, right? And what you're going to write on will have to do with something covered in the first half of the course. The first half of the course meaning the first 5 weeks. All right, so that's and that paper is going to account for 30% of your grade. There's a final exam, which is a take-home final exam, and that means it's open book. You can use all your books, you can use your notes, you can use the lectures here. These lectures, by the way, are being video streamed, so you can access these lectures later on at will. Okay, that, by the way, should not be an excuse to not come to class, because there is a difference between listening to the lectures here and listening to them here. There's a different degree of attentiveness, and there's a different kind of class dynamic that develops. And there are going to be questions that are going to be posed to me which you'll not be able to hear on the tape. Okay, I can tell you that from previous experience, because I've had my classes video streamed for the last 5 years. All right, you had a question?
Yeah, they're just being video streamed to YouTube, right?
Sorry?
Where are they being video streamed to? YouTube?
Oh, well, no, not YouTube. You go to the Bruincast website, okay, and you can recover them from there. Yeah. All you have to do is, as I said, just go to that website. This class, there was a version of it that was taught 5 years ago, and those lectures are now on YouTube. Okay, but the material being covered this time is quite different. So some of the readings are entirely new, and therefore my lectures are not going to be identical to the lectures that were given in 2009. Yes?
Are the online readings the same as the one or the links to the articles posted on the syllabus? Or
Yes.
Is it like on the different website?
Yeah. Whatever is on the syllabus, those are the online readings. Yeah.
Okay.
Other than the books which were ordered for you. Right? So if there's a book that you're expected to read in its entirety, that's not available online. And it's not possible for me to put it online because there are copyright regulations and restrictions which would prevent me from doing that. Okay? So if there are books that you're supposed to read either in their entirety or in substantial measure, right? If there are 250 pages of a 300-page book that you're supposed to read, then that book has been ordered for you. So I think there are 5 books that have been ordered for you. I don't know what the cumulative cost is. It should be somewhere in the neighborhood of about $75, I would imagine, for those 5 books. And as I said, you don't have to go to Ackerman. You can buy them from somewhere else if you should want to do that. Yeah.
I was going to say online or like April, Amazon, you can add it to like 30 really. Not cheaper.
So I didn't get the last part?
Actually, I was just going to say usually online the books in total they can have to around like only $30 or so.
Could be. Yeah. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit about the final exam. Okay, so as I've already mentioned, it's a take-home, open book exam. You can access all the readings, lectures, whatever you wish. You have, I think, about 5 days to write the exam. The format of the exam is very simple. You're going to be given 6 essay questions, and you're going to answer 4 out of those 6 essay questions. There's no multiple choice, there's no ID questions, nothing of that kind. Just essay questions. Okay? And these these questions are divided into 3 groups of 2 questions each. So group 1, there are 2 questions, and you have to answer both questions in group 1. Group 2 has 2 questions, and you answer 1 out of those 2 questions. Group 3 has 2 questions, and you answer 1 out of those 2 questions. So you answer a total of 4 questions with some element of choice, right? Because, as I said, in groups 2 and 3, you have 2 questions each, and you answer 1 out of those 2 questions. You're going to write approximately 2 to 3 pages, minimum of 2 pages, maximum really of 3 pages for each question, again, double-spaced, Times New Roman. So your exam will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 pages in length, and obviously it must be submitted, as a typed exam, and closer to the date I'll let you know whether it's going to be adequate for you to send it to me by email as an online attachment, or whether I need you to print it out. I mean, the syllabus says that you need to print it out and bring it to my office, I think, but we may possibly modify that towards the end. Okay, but the format of the exam doesn't change. That's the exact format of the exam. All right, and then so that's 60% of your grade. That's a total of 90%. 10% of the grade is at the instructor's discretion, which simply means that 10% is for the most part neutral, except in cases where if I know a student hasn't been showing up in class at all, and I'm not taking attendance because we're well beyond that stage where we need to take attendance, right? But very often I'll tell you one simple way in which I know that some student hasn't shown up. I mean, it's remarkable, and even though I mention that in every class, there's still people who will not show up. So you turn in your midterm exam to me, paper, and by the end of the 10th week, despite 5 attempts by me to return the papers in class, that person still hasn't collected their paper. They haven't showed up in class. I know that. Okay? So, and what that's would simply do is that 10% would hurt you in that case, but in most cases it simply stays neutral. If there are people in here who are really active, because when I lecture, I'm going to give you an opportunity to question me. Right? I mean, if there's a person who needs a clarification, or you want to contest an argument that I made, I'm happy to listen to it. Right? And if you are taking active participation in the class, that 10% can help you. So if you are borderline B+ at the end of your final exam and your first paper, borderline between B+ and A-, well, then active participation will push you into the A- range. Okay, that's what that 10% effectively does. Are there any clarifications that you would like from me regarding anything I've said up till this point in time? Any clarifications regarding requirements, material, course materials, anything of that kind? All right. Let me then continue by laying out some broad features of the arguments that I want to put before you. But one way to do that is to go through the syllabus. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through the syllabus with you. If you brought a printout with you, you can follow me. But if you didn't, that's fine, because I'll tell you effectively what is it that we're going to be covering in this class. So it gives you a very good idea of what you can expect. So in the following lecture, that's week 1. I'm counting this as week 0. Week 1, we're going to talk about the last years of the independence struggle, right? Because as I said, in order to understand the point of origin of this course, which is 1947, I think you need a little bit background. You need to understand a little bit about what India was like under colonial rule, right? What happened in the preceding years, right? The kinds of negotiations that were taking place for Indian independence, not the nitty-gritty detail, because they fill up volumes, right? How is it that independence was achieved? And why was it achieved in this particular form? Why did it happen in 1947? And you know, of course, that the big watershed mark before that is 1945, which is the conclusion of World War II. Right? And at the conclusion of World War II, Britain was faced with the prospect that it really couldn't hold on to its colonies in India. Right? Much of the world, but certainly India, where the struggle for independence had been going on for some decades. And I think there's no question that the Indian independence struggle was unique. And it was unique partly because its most well-known architect was, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, or Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the chief architect of Indian independence, and certainly the person who brought forth the idea of mass non-violent resistance into the public domain for the first time in history. Right? Which is not to say that the idea of non-violence per se had not circulated before in other parts of the world, but the idea of mass non-violent resistance is something that is distinct to India in the 20th century. Right? First half of the 20th century, before this idea is now going to be embraced in other parts of the world, including the United States and the Deep South, to some extent, complicated history to some extent in South Africa, right? And so forth and so on. So what we're going to do in the following two lectures is we're going to look at the last years of the independence struggle, the partition of India. What exactly did the partition of India really mean? What were some of its consequences? How was the line drawn between India and Pakistan? So let's say this is the map of undivided India. This is India, okay? What you have here is this is the Bay of Bengal, right? Bay of Bengal, and on the other side you have the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean over here. So this is going to now become Pakistan in 1947. So when we say a new country was crafted, how did they draw the line? Because every nation state has boundaries, right? I think you would agree. There's no nation state without a boundary. So how did they draw the line? Right? And we're just saying, let's say randomly this is the line. Right? This is the line. So everything east of this becomes India. Everything west of this becomes Pakistan. And I'm not giving you the entire picture here because, and this is really unique in world history, that Pakistan itself was going to have two halves. So there's going to be a portion of Pakistan which is going to be over here. And we'll see how that happened, you know. And how do you actually have a country which has two halves? Now somebody could say, well, isn't Alaska, you know, that's part of the United States and that's like miles away from the rest of mainland United States. Okay, but we're talking about one state over there. And what we're talking about here is we're talking about two Muslim majority provinces, because what was the idea of Pakistan? The idea was, I'm putting it to you in the simplest terms right now, we'll complicate it later on, that the idea was that you would create a Muslim majority state, right? A Muslim majority state. So that the Muslims in India, they would then become part of a nation state called Pakistan. The one problem that they all had to contend with was that there were Muslims scattered throughout India. So there was a big Muslim population here in the city of Hyderabad. And when I say big, I'm not talking about, you know, obviously, you know, hundreds of tens of thousands. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of people, right? And then there is a Muslim majority state over here called Awadh or Lucknow, so forth and so on. And they're Muslims scattered all over India, right? So what about them? Where are they going to go? Will they continue to stay on India, or they're all going to migrate to Pakistan? And more importantly, as I said, how do you draw the line? Now, very often lines are drawn between nation states based on natural borders. So let's say the Rio Grande, right, becomes a border, effectively. Right? But what's a natural boundary there? There isn't any. Right? And what if the cartographer decided that he was going to draw a line through a village where there were both Hindus and Muslims? And who is the cartographer? Who is drawing the line? I can tell you who drew the line in India. And it's an astonishing story in itself. You could write a book just on that. You know, the person who was given the responsibility of drawing the line So the British government created what's called a boundary commission. A boundary commission. Right? And so you appoint a number of people on that commission. And supposedly they take a collective decision, but the boundary commission had a chairman. The chairman effectively took the decision about where you're going to draw the line. His name is Sir Cyril Radcliffe. We're going to talk about him a little bit later on. Now, Sir Cyril Radcliffe's greatest distinction was that he knew nothing about India. He had never been to India. He lived in Scotland. And the British said, we're going to fly this man out from there, and he's going to come here and he's going to draw a line and he's going to decide the fate of hundreds of millions of people. Imagine. Right? And in fact, not only did he not know India, he positively detested India, loathed it. We know that from his diary, because when he comes to India and he tries to get out of there as quick as he can, get on the next plane out, man. You don't want to live in India. Why? Because in the diary he tells you, I'm being bitten by mosquitoes, the heat and the dust, and he's got diarrhea, he's running to the bathroom every 1 hour. I mean, he's supposed to draw a line here, right? To decide the fortunes of tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people. And in his diary, he just keeps on writing about how he positively detests this country. So this is the man who's going to draw the line. And of course, someone could say, well, that's a caricature because things had to be more complicated. Well, they weren't necessarily much more complicated, frankly. I mean, there is a boundary commission. He's going to be assisted by a number of men there. But that's effectively, of course, they study maps. They look at all the maps and figure out, okay, maybe the line should zigzag this way, that way. It should go around this village or this town. Right? But effectively, we're still left with a problem. So these are some of the things that precede 1947. And their effects, of course, continue into 1947. And then we're going to look at Gandhi's assassination, because Gandhi is going to be assassinated 6 months after independence, and the birth of the nation state. Right? And what is a nation state? Because recall that when you do the history of India, we have to remember that India as a civilization has a history that goes back 4,000 years. Right? Of course, the Hindu nationalists will tell you it's 40,000 years. It's not. Right? It's 4,000 years, maybe 5,000 years. But that's a history of a civilization. We're looking at the history, which is a minuscule portion of that, when India becomes a nation state. Right? And what's a nation state? What kind of entity is a nation state? What's the difference between a nation state and a nation? Are they the same thing? Right? Okay.
Is it that a nation is more developed than a nation state, and a nation?
A nation is more developed. What's the United States? It's a nation state, right? I mean, what is the United Nations? The United Nations is an international organization of nation states. Right? So no, I don't know if I would agree that a nation is more developed than a nation state. Yes?
Would the category be if it has colonies of its own? So unlike the US, India hasn't succeeded to that same level of...
Colonies of its own, but we have 140 nation states. They don't all have colonies. Somalia, Zambia, Rwanda, Uganda, Peru, Chile, these are all nation states. They don't have colonies of their own.
Well, no, that's my point.
Yeah.
And a nation would.
A nation would have colonies. I don't think so. I don't think that that's a difference between a nation and a nation state. No. Let's try a few more possibilities.
A nation, it's basically the concept of nationality. And a state is basically an institution of, let's say, sovereignty and coercion over the territory.
Okay, we're getting a little bit closer to what might be the crux of the matter. So a state gives a principle of sovereignty, okay, and legitimacy. But can we sharpen this in some ways? If I pose the question to you this way, all right, there are lots of hands up. I'll try to take a couple more, but let me pose the question this way, reformulate it a little bit to see if it helps you. Can we think of a nation that is not a nation state? Can we think of a people who are a nation but do not have a nation state? Yes.
The Native American tribes here refer to themselves as a nation. They are a distinct culture within the state.
Okay, but that example, you're right. But that example is actually quite complicated. It's quite complicated because we're not talking about one nation of American Indians either. There are dozens, right? The Cherokee is one, right?
Yes.
The Sioux would be another, the Apache, whatever. These are all nations, but they're not nation states, right? Which is where we go to the comment of the student next to you, that there the question of sovereignty becomes important. Let's try to sharpen it. What would be the most dramatic example in the world, the one that we all know of for people who think of themselves as a nation but do not have a nation state? Yes?
I was going to ask a question about the nation state. Isn't it like defined by something like having a common language, usually common religion?
Well, then India is not a nation state. There's no common language. There's no common language in India. India does not have a national language at all. You know, I've sometimes said it does, but I mean it very colloquially when I say that, because the most commonly spoken language, but that's only in North India, is Hindi, but it doesn't have a national language. And in fact, even Canada, let's take a country that's a lot less complicated than India. Because India is just far too complicated, right? I mean, if I took out a banknote and showed it to you from India, the amount, 10 rupees or 100 rupees or 1,000 rupees, it's written in 15 languages. In Canada, at best, you have two, English and French. And that's only in Quebec, right? I mean, French is not going to work in Toronto. It's going to work in Quebec. At best, you have two languages in Canada. India, you've got dozens, hundreds. So by that definition, India is not a nation state, right? Because it doesn't have a common language. Yeah. At the back there. Yeah. No, that right. Yeah.
The idea of a nation state more defined by the disruptive idea of nationalism, and that everybody is considered a part of itself.
Okay. So do you know that there was a referendum that took place last week which failed in Scotland for Scottish independence? Now, I would say that the Scottish were being nationalists, right? What did they want? They wanted a nation state of their own, didn't they? They're a nation, you could say, but again, that's actually a little complicated. I could talk about it at very great length, because one of the things that I work on is the British Empire, so therefore I've long been interested in, obviously, the case of the Scots and the Irish, and what their relationship is to the English. But I want to take an example that's much more obvious, which no one has mentioned so far. The Palestinians are the best example of a people who think of themselves as a nation but do not have a nation state. Right? And you should be able to see the difference now. Because the Palestinians are a nation. They think of themselves as defined by people with a common history, okay? Defined by a common language. Nation, not nation state. They're a nation because they have a common language, Arabic, right? They think of themselves as having a shared past, so forth and so on. And they're flung all over the world. There's a Palestinian diaspora. They would want a nation state. So the Palestinians are an illustration. I won't be able to take any questions right now for a moment. The Palestinians are the best illustration of a people who are a nation without a nation state. Let me give you a different definition. A nation state is a nation backed up by a military, by a navy and an army. Backed up by the power to hand out passports. A nation state gives passports, a nation doesn't. Right? So when you have an American passport, you are a citizen of the United States of America, which is a nation state. Now, you know, there was a group of people in India called the Khalistanis. So the Khalistani movement, what is a Khalistani movement? You're going to hear about it a lot more, sometime in the second half of the course perhaps. Okay? So the Khalistanis are Sikh militants. You know, Sikhs are members of an Indian they follow a religion which is called Sikhism, and you can identify them by their turban. But don't try to identify them only by their turban unless you know how to distinguish between different kinds of turbans, because lots of Americans thought they knew who Sikhs were. And after 9/11, the first victim of a racial attack in the United States after 9/11 was a Sikh who was killed because the person who killed him thought he was killing a Muslim, right? Because they wear a turban. And of course, Muslims immediately became associated with a turban following 9/11 because Osama bin Laden wore a turban. But the Sikh turban is quite different. Now, we don't need to have a whole class on turbans and how to tie turbans, okay, and how you distinguish one turban from another. All I'm saying here is that Sikhs are adherents of an Indian religion called Sikhism, and some among them wanted a separate nation state for themselves, okay, which they called Khalistan. And they began to hand out passports because they created a government in exile, partly in the United States, partly in Canada, partly in Great Britain. And they would actually hand out passports. You're a citizen of Khalistan. Well, try walking into the United States with a passport from Khalistan and see if you can get into the country. Of course you can't, because it's not a recognized nation state, right? So nation state is a nation with also power to enforce its borders' sovereignty. That's where sovereignty comes in. Because when you have sovereignty, it means you have sovereignty over your defined borders. And that is why the department here is called Department of Homeland Security. And one of the things that the Homeland Security is supposed to do is to guard the borders, besides guarding the President of the United States, which apparently they've not been very good at recently, right? That's what it means, sovereignty. Sovereignty, borders, and then all the paraphernalia that comes with that, including passports, right? Which is a very modern invention, a very modern invention. The passport was only invented about 100 years ago. Nobody ever used passports. You know, the people who came to the United States in the 17th century, 18th century, they didn't come with passports. They didn't come to Ellis Island flashing a passport with them. So these are very modern concepts. And I want you to keep that in mind, because what we're doing is we're looking at the history of India as a nation state here, effectively. We're not looking at the entire history of India during the long period that it has been a civilization. And one of the running themes of this course is the fact, according to me, that there is a tension between the idea of India as a nation state and the idea of India as a civilization. This tension is going to inform a great deal of what happens in India post 1947. Okay, so that's what week 1 is. Week 2, India since independence, a critical overview. We could just do a long overview in here. When I say long overview now, what kinds of questions are we interested in? Well, we're interested in, for example, what kind of progress has India made in economic terms? Okay? I'll give you a few instances of what is at stake here. If you look at India today, some of you might have read in the newspapers, in the New York Times, that India had a mission to Mars recently. Okay? So it's joined this elite club of countries that have sent satellites into orbit into Mars now, right? And that elite group of countries includes, of course, the United States, Britain, 2 or 3 other countries, right? On the other hand, 50% of the population of India is today suffering from malnutrition. I don't care how many government reports try to disguise that or deny that. This is simply an indisputable fact according to all the evidence we have from independent researchers, from serious researchers, from NGO groups, from activists, right? 50% of India is suffering from malnutrition. More than 50% of the population of India, more than 50% does not have access to a toilet, a flush toilet. Well over 50%, I'm giving you a very modest figure here, okay, do not have access to a flush toilet. And on the other hand, as I said, they've sent a mission into Mars, right? India is a nuclear state, one of a handful of countries that is a nuclear state. And some people say that, well, one of the interesting things about India, and I think it's certainly very interesting, interesting here is a neutral word though, right? We know very often interesting is neutral. If somebody loves a book and they say, did you read it, and you did, and you thought it was, frankly, the borest, the most boring book you'd ever read in your life, you say, it was interesting, right? It was interesting. So very often that word disguises a lot of things. Now, what I'm saying here is that if you look at the data coming from India, okay, on the one hand you've got all of these achievements, and on the other hand you've got a huge portion of India's population suffering from malnutrition, not having clean access to a toilet, so forth and so on, right? And so then people say, the most interesting thing is that India lives simultaneously in many different periods of time. That is an interesting thought. And here the word interesting is not really neutral, right? It does. I mean, if you ever come to my office and, to see me during my office hours, which I hope you do, you will see I've got a little photograph clipped out from a newspaper which is posted on the front door. And it's an Indian gas station. And at the gas pump, there are two bullock carts. Okay, it's a bullock cart. Well, what is a bullock cart doing? Okay. Right? I mean, are they feeding gas into the cow? What are they doing? Right? Very, very odd if you think about it. But that's India. So on the one hand, you've got, rockets, and you've got a very advanced military, and on the other hand, you've got obviously people who are, suffering greatly because India has by far the largest population of poor people in the world. Again, no question about that. And there are going to be comparisons with China constantly. But I think that if you're looking really at the measures that we have seen, I think whatever the situation may have been 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, today I think China has been able to lift a great deal more people out of poverty than has India in the course of the last 2 decades. Now, that is simply a blanket fact. That doesn't mean that we are interpreting that fact. Right? Because then, of course, we'd have to ask, what is the relationship between authoritarianism and development? Is the reason why China's development has taken place at a much greater rate is because it's an authoritarian state? And I think there's no question that it is an authoritarian state. Right? Is there a relationship? Do states develop faster when there are fewer obstacles on the way? I was in Shanghai a few years ago. 2010. Well, there for 2.5 weeks. And I saw something that really astonished me, because I don't think I would see that in the US, and I would certainly not see it in India either. So the hotel I was staying at, you turn around the corner and you're on a main road, and the very first evening that I arrived there, I'm taking a walk down this main road, and there's this store there, and it had been emptied out, whatever it was before. Now they were redoing the whole store. Okay? They were remodeling it. They were going to then, at this point, they were still putting up planks, and they were really extensive remodeling. That was, now knowing the pace at which things work in India, that would take about 2 years. You remodel it, you paint it, you have leisurely tea breaks. Maybe you do 1 hour of painting every day, and then you decide, well, you need this and that permit. How many officials have to be bribed before you can get a permit to run that store? How many zoning laws do you have to think about? Is it environmentally safe? This, that, right? Before my eyes, I saw that store transformed into a fully functional bookstore, where all the books, by the way, they hadn't just been dumped. Okay, you just dump them. No, they're actually, in order, in alphabetical order, right? Before my eyes in 2.5 weeks. I don't think it would happen in the US either, by the way. Certainly not given the pace at which they're working on the 405, which has been going on for 10 years. God knows what they're doing. I have no idea. I don't see any difference at all, right? Because in China, of course, forget about all these administrative regulations and handicaps and zoning laws. If the state says do it, you just do it. Which is why you can build a brand new airport, with a terminal which is 500 million square feet in less than 3 years. I mean, in the US, it would take 30 years to do that, right? So this is what I mean. That's an authoritarian state. And when you have an authoritarian state, there's an interesting argument which we're going to consider at considerable length. What is the relationship between authoritarian states and the pace of development? Is the pace of development much slower in India, partially because it's a democracy? And of course, the Indian middle classes would love to elect, and they have now elected, an autocratic leader, because they want to see India become a bit more like China, frankly. Right? So for those of you kept up with the news, you know that India had elections this year, and they elected to power a man called Narendra Modi, who was in the United States until just a few days ago on his first visit to the US. He just left. Right? All right, so this overview is going to give you a sense of, well, what are the stakes here? Right? In economic terms. Another illustration. I don't think anybody here, unless you have had a class with me before and heard this data before, if you did, don't raise your hands. Okay? What was the life expectancy in India in 1947? You think. Okay? Life expectancy. You know what it is today. Does anybody know what the life expectancy is roughly? I don't need an exact figure, and the exact figure can change. What is the life expectancy in India today, you think? Today. Let's talk about today. And what is the life expectancy? And we'll average it out for female and male, because usually the life expectancy for women is 3 to 4 years more than it is for men in most countries of the world. What is the average life expectancy? Let's begin with the United States. 80. Any other guess? It's not that high. It's a little bit lower. 76. Closer to 76. Okay? When you get to Japan, 80. You know, okay? But not the United States. Okay? What is the average life expectancy in India today, you think?
35.
35? Boy, now, India is underdeveloped, yes, but not. Okay. I mean, that is really low. 35. I mean, it's a miracle I'm here, because I'm in my 50s. Okay. Someone else had a guess?
60.
Okay. Any other guess? 66, approximately. Okay? Quite good. Considering that 50% of the population, at least, suffers from malnutrition. If you make it past the age of 5, your chances in India are probably not any worse than the chances of most of the people in the industrial countries of the North. Right? So for someone like me growing up in India, if I've made it past the age of 5 and 10, and I come from a middle-class family, you know, I can probably expect to live as long as most Americans can. Going into my 70s, 80s. Indian classical musicians, for reasons I'm not going to get into right now, they go on until their 90s. And the Sanskrit Pandits, it must be the discipline of the mind. The Sanskrit Pandits, they live on until their 90s, many of them. Okay? Very interesting. The two groups of people that I know of whose longevity is remarkable in India, classical musicians. Right? Okay? So, but now, what do you think the life expectancy of India was in 1947? And think about why I'm asking you this question, because of course in 1947 India became free, but also because, recall that one of the things that the British said for a long time was, we've come here to civilize and develop this country. Right? So what did the development of India under the British mean? And what do you think the life expectancy was in India in 1947? 29. 29. I'm serious. You just read up the census of 1941. Read up the details. After 200 years of colonial rule, where the British were going to develop us, right, make us civilized, what they ended up doing was leaving India at a stage where the life expectancy was 29. Okay? So now someone will say, well, India has made a huge amount of progress, because it was 29, now it's 66. But then again, there are others who will counter by saying, well, yeah, but that has to do with the fact that there have been enormous advances in medicine, for example. Enormous advances, particularly surgical advancements have been enormous. Right? we do know from the social history of medicine all over the world that even in the United States and Britain, what really lifted the life expectancy of people were not surgical advances. It was simply advances in nutrition, hygiene, sanitation. You take care of these three things in most countries of the world, and you will immediately increase the life expectancy by leaps and bounds. No question about it. Okay? So when we do this overview, we're going to be looking at the economic segment. We're also going to be looking at the political segment. Let's face it, the indisputable fact is that most countries that were colonized, right, and that became free, most of them eventually ended up becoming military dictatorships, autocratic states. India did not. And yes, there is a genuine dispute about to what extent India is really democratic. Of course, from my standpoint, there's a genuine dispute about whether the United States is genuinely democratic, frankly. Okay? I mean, if the modus operandi in this country is drone attacks and wars all the time, because the US is in a perpetual state of war, frankly. It's a war regime. This is a war economy, constantly. Right? So then you have to say, and some people would also argue this is an oligarchy, you know. You can look at data. I don't have to furnish it. There are thousands of texts out there on Google that if you look at the economic divide in this country, it has sharpened extraordinarily on the course of the last 3 to 4 decades. The percentage of wealth owned by the top 1% of the population of the country is astronomical. It's over 80%. Okay? And the 10 richest people in the United States, they have more wealth than 20 countries of sub-Saharan Africa put together. I mean, that's what you're talking about. So some people would say, well, no, this is not really a democracy, it's an oligarchy. It's a rule of the rich by the rich, for the rich. You know? So we can dispute what a democracy really means, and there's, of course, a genuine dispute about to what extent India is really a democracy. You know? But nonetheless, having said that, there is no question that in comparison to Pakistan, in comparison to Afghanistan, in comparison to Somalia, Sudan, etc., you know, countries that were colonized, India has retained a democratic system. When 5 years, the term of the government is up, right? It's over, you have elections. India just went through a massive electoral exercise, right? And I realize, of course, I think more than most people, the dangers of simply relating democracy to elections. We have elections here too, right? But then you have to say, well, what is the real degree of choice that you have, right? If it's Tweedledee and Tweedledum all the time, which is what it seems to me, right? Well, that's not really elections from my point of view, you know. Okay, but I'm saying these are questions that would have to be entertained, and what we're going to do in the overview is we're going to look very broadly at some developments in India, 1947, economic developments, political developments. Week 3, development and economic well-being. So that looks at some of these questions in much greater detail. So we look at what has been the degree of progress, economic progress in India, you know, industrialization, new you know, the kind of neoliberal policies that were brought into place 1990 approximately. What consequences have those had? Has there been a gap in India as well between the rich and the poor? We also know, by the way, that there's been a tremendous growth of the middle class in India, tremendous growth. And of course there are people who would say that, well, yes, it's illusory because, frankly, you know, 75 to 80% of the population lives below the poverty line. You know, 80% of the population, frankly. I mean, there's this, what is called the NSS, National Sample Survey, which is the most authoritative organization, and its credibility is not doubted by anybody in India. It is a neutral organization which does extensive surveys and statistical work. And the NSS in 2011 reported that 80% of the population of India lived on less than $2 a day. 80% of the population lived on less than $2 a day. Granted, a dollar can get you a little further in India than it can over here, but even then, It cannot get you that far. An egg still costs the same. You know, gas costs more in India than it costs over here. Electricity is more expensive in India than it is over here. And you're living on less than $2 a day, 80% of the population. Right? So then you have to say, well, what is the degree of progress that we've really made? What are some of the problems? So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at some of these questions, but we're not going to just simply look at statistics. We're going to look at, obviously, qualitative assessments. We're going to see what kind of interpretation we can place on some of these facts. Does India still go through famines? No, it doesn't. But in British India, famines were very, very frequent. And this week you're going to have a surprise visitor to this class, one of India's most well-known, activists, scholars. In fact, you have a reading by him. This syllabus was drawn up before I was able to arrange for him to come here. So he's going to speak to our class. P. Sainath, Everyone Loves a Good Drought. Okay, that's a reading from him, and he's going to be in class, and he's going to talk to you. And he's going to talk to you about a number of things. For example, the fact that 250,000 farmers in India have committed suicide over the last 20 years. 250,000. Okay, he was the rural affairs editor of The Hindu, which is the most well-known English daily, English language newspaper, right? Rural affairs editor. He's traveled widely over India, knows the conditions firsthand. Right? So he's going to be in class with us on the 21st of October. Then week 4, politics and the Indian state. So now we look at some of these questions having to do with democracy. Grassroots movements, okay? Local movements. For those of you who keep up with Indian politics, you know that there was a party that came up a couple of years ago. It's almost vanished again. The Aam Aadmi Party, right? And they were supposed to represent a kind of a challenge to the existing political order. But again, virtually wiped out. In the last elections, they got only a few seats. Right? But those are some of the political developments that have taken place in India in the post-1947 period. And we're also going to look at tensions. We're going to look at communal violence. We're going to look at tensions between Hindus and Muslims. We're going to look at the role of the state in relationship to these groups of people. You know, is a state neutral always? And obviously, not all of these questions can be addressed at very great length. In week 5, we attempt to address some of them in greater detail because we look at the whole problem of communalism. I'm going to tell you what that word means, because this is a very particular usage, extremely widespread in India. And communalism here refers to very broadly what we might describe as religious conflict, religious tension. And this could be between Hindus and Muslims. It could be between different groups of Muslims. It could be between the Shias and the Sunnis. It could be between the Sikhs and the Hindus. Right? What is the nature of this animosity? Has this animosity always been there, which is what the colonial argument used to be? Or is it fueled by economic and political interest? Right? In the state of Gujarat, in 2002, the person who is now the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, in 2002, he was the Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat. And in Gujarat in 2002, there was a pogrom. A pogrom meaning there was widespread incitement to violence and killing against Muslims. And Narendra Modi happened to be the Chief Minister of Gujarat at that time. And there were allegations that he had been complicit. Complicit in the sense that he was the person who could have put a stop to it, but didn't. Right? And so there was a whole amnesty report. There's a report by Human Rights Watch. Right? And you know that Narendra Modi could not visit the United States because he was denied a visa by the American government. Of course, once he became Prime Minister, it became impossible to do that. You know, right? Extremely complicated situation that we're talking about here. But what we're speaking about is, so what is the complicity of the state? Did the state know that a pogrom was being orchestrated against the Muslims? What is the complicity of ordinary people? Because there is complicity of ordinary people, unfortunately, as there was, for example, in Nazi Germany. You know, it's not simply people at the top who are, you know, issuing the orders, and then you've got hundreds of thousands, millions of people being slaughtered, which is what happened. They were slaughtered. The Jews were slaughtered. Many other people have been slaughtered as well. And this was not only on account of orders passed by the state. Okay? It was partially on account of the complicity of ordinary people. People who are bystanders, who simply sit by and watch and see what's happening. Right? Or who lend their name to this enterprise. Okay, so this is what we're going to look at under week 5. Week 6, we're going to look at Dalits. Dalits are the people who live at the margins of Indian society. They've been highly energized by politics today. They have strong political representation. They constitute well over 10% of the population of India, right? Well over 10% of the population of India. They used to be called the untouchables 7-8 decades ago. There are various designations for them, but these are the people who belong to the historically the rock bottom of Indian society. So we're going to really look here at sharp economic inequalities, but it's not only a matter of economic inequalities here. It's a matter of what is the worldview with which they are apprehended. Okay? How do they respond? To what degree do they resist? Right? What is the nature of oppression in a modern society, a modern nation state like India today? Right? What is the future of a group of people like the Dalits? Week 7, work and life in the city. Right? One of the major shifts in Indian history is a larger number of people in the aftermath of India gravitating towards the city. Right? The city where I was born, Delhi, before 1947, it had a population of less than 500,000. Today, according to the United Nations, right, it is the second largest city in the world with a population of 20 million. I mean, astronomical growth. All cities change, of course. New York in 1947 today are not the same, but we're not talking about population shifts of this kind. What does this migration mean? Okay, what happens to the people who get left behind? How do you maintain contact in the city with those left behind in the village? How do you create a new life for yourself? Do you land up on the streets? Do you land up in the gutter? Right? What is the nature of life in the city? Can you divide the city into different sectors? We know you can. South Central LA and Beverly Hills are two different. I'm sure there are people in Beverly Hills who have never been to South Central LA. Just as there are people on the west side. I was talking with a colleague of mine who's been living in Los Angeles for 30 years. I live in Encino. And he said, I've been to the valley 5 times, he told me, in the last 30 years. I mean, it's like an entirely different world. Right? For them. So a city is not one thing. So how do we look at the city by day and the city by night? There are people who lead their professions at night. There are people who lead their professions by day. Are these two different cities? Right? So we want to look at some of the literature. And these are not all historical writings that we look at. In this case, what we're looking at is one single book by Aman Sethi, which I had mentioned at the beginning of this class, called A Free Man, which is a 200-page book about the life of a laborer in Delhi. Okay? Week 8, women in South Asia. Here we look at questions of gender. What has been the place of women in Indian public life, in Indian political life? Right? How do women interact in the public sphere with men? Are public spheres largely gendered? Are there largely masculine spaces? You know that in many countries of the world, the public sphere is a largely masculine space. Right? And even in the US, there are spaces that are gendered in certain ways, but certainly in India, there are certain spheres of life which are exclusively gendered. Here, the professions, by the way, are completely gendered, completely. I mean, if you're a librarian, the likelihood is that you're female. If you're a school teacher, particularly kindergarten, elementary school, likelihood is that you're female. 98% of the teachers in the United States at the kindergarten level, primary level, are female. Professions are extremely gendered. Now you go to the computer science department, 90% male. Okay? That's what I mean. And the public spheres can be gendered in certain ways as well. What about the role of women in Indian cinema, for example? Right? How do you reconcile that with other kinds of representations of Indian women? So we're going to be looking at some of these kinds of questions. The preference for boys over girls, and what have been the consequences? We have an article by Amartya Sen, major Indian writer, winner of the Nobel Prize, and he's got a piece called 100 Million Women Are Missing in India. That this preference for boys over girls led to the fact that when a woman found out that she was pregnant and she would have a test done, an amniocentesis, and found out that the fetus was female, it would be aborted. And of course, you know, the same argument has been made about another country, right? China, right? Huge shortage of females in China. Okay, so we're going to be looking at some of these questions. And then finally, week 9, the Hindi film. I've already spoken about it very casually to you. And you're going to be seeing a film before you come to class, because we're going to be discussing that particular film. It's a film about which I wrote a whole book, and you're going to be reading that book. It's a very short book, but it's an extremely iconic film, one of the major works of commercial Hindi cinema over the course of the last 5 decades. And then finally, we have a section which is going to be on globalization, modernity, and some reflections on India's future, right? Where does India belong in the modern world? What is the nature of globalization in India? What kinds of anxieties does it induce? So forth and so on. All right, so that's the trajectory of this course. I think you have a pretty good idea of what is at stake and what you can expect. And in my following lecture on Tuesday, I'm going to begin by looking at what's happening in the early to mid-1940s before independence.
Professor, do you